I'm Helena Cobban, and I'm the president of Just World Educational Foundation. I'm really pleased to be here today with my good friend Ian Williams, who is a veteran UN watcher, somebody who has been a correspondent at the UN since 1989, has 2 times been the president of the UN Correspondents Association. He's published many books, including apparently one about rum that he hasn't given me a copy of yet.
Tequila.
Oh, and tequila. So anyway, but most importantly of all, Ian is the author of this fine volume, Untold, the Real Story of the United Nations in Peace and War, which is an engaging romp through the United Nations with a lot of great cartoons, and most importantly of all, it tells you everything you need to know about the United Nations. Whether you are a complete newcomer who is just starting to learn about the organization, or if you're a veteran diplomat. I mean, we've had people at some of Ian's events. By the way, this event is part of the series called US, the United Nations and the World, a speaker series with Ian Williams. So we've had people at some of our events who are fairly senior students and experts and even participants in the UN who say that Ian has uncovered little stories from inside the organization that they had never heard before, including a fascinating one about Alger Hiss, but we probably won't have time to talk about that today, because what I want us to spend our 35 minutes here talking about is mainly the effects on the Middle East of the Trump administration coming, having named Nikki Haley as ambassador to the UN, since which the US-UN relationship has definitely taken a new turn.
Frayed, you could say.
Frayed considerably. So that, we need to really understand how the UN works and what the US role is there. But let's take as a first case study Jerusalem and what the president has done here to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and to say he's going to move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So Ian, what does that do to UN traditions, UN practice, UN legislation and the US-UN relationship?
Well, you were talking about the effect of the UN on the Middle East. I think the effect of the Middle East on the UN is almost equally important, because it's eroded and corroded the US-UN relationship from a very early time, from 1967 onwards. It was not always thus. But the whole problem, in fact, the UN created the problem with the General Assembly resolution, which partitioned the mandate of Palestine.
So that goes back further than 67, that goes back to 47.
But that's the UN and the Middle East. It was the US relationship. Now, the US pushed that. The British, by the way, voted against
the partition.
Yes, but this was in the General Assembly, so Britain didn't have a veto. And in those days, things were more fluid. So the US managed to whip in a majority in the General Assembly. And that was regarded as binding. The Israeli Declaration of Independence takes that resolution and cites it as a mandate for its own existence. It's a legitimation.
So if the partition resolution was in essence the birth certificate for the state of Israel, it was also a birth certificate for the state of Palestine.
It was indeed, and not just that, but the codicil in this birth certificate, if you have such a thing, it pointed out that Jerusalem wasn't part of the patrimony here.
Right.
Jerusalem was a corpus separatum to be under international control, and that's why, until to this day, there are no foreign embassies in Jerusalem.
There are consulates, but not embassies.
Yes, nobody accepts that Jerusalem is part of Israel, or part of Palestine, by the way. The Palestinians are getting a bit ahead of themselves here. It could be as part of a final solution. But
let's not talk final solutions, please.
Yes, final solution is bad, yes. But so that went on for years, as you know, and then in 1967, the Israelis took the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. Yes, took. Scrubbed. And this led to a whole series of UN resolutions saying that, all referring to the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force.
Which is key. I mean, it's one of the.
It's the key principle of the UN, because the League of Nations was very much about peoples under Woodrow Wilson's influence. A lot of the League of Nations actually birthed nations almost, because it was drawing the boundaries, it was doing the referenda, it was saying,
but let's stick with Jerusalem.
But the United Nations is about relations between states, and this was the interesting part, was that in subsequent years, the US, once it lost its majority in the General Assembly, decided, under the influence of the Israel problem, that the General Assembly resolutions weren't binding. And you'll find every pro-Israeli lawyer will now say the General Assembly resolutions aren't binding.
So which year did that happen?
It was a gradual process. It's been growing. I mean, the US actually invoked the General Assembly to run the Korean War for it when it was hidebound, when the Soviets vetoed it in the Security Council.
Right.
So when Nasser al-Qidwa, the Palestinian ambassador, came years later, he decided that there was a resolutionary road to liberation, and he restated all of the international law, because he realized, I think, in the acute Palestinians, there was no military solution, but the legislative, the legal approach,
legalistic,
the legal rights of the Palestinians, and this looks almost like a doctrine of despair, but you have to remember that this doctrine of the inadmissibility of territory by force, after all these years, Morocco still has not got clear title to Western Sahara. All of the years that East Timor was under Indonesian occupation, never got title, and it's now independent. You know, these things are binding. The UN has this unique legitimizing principle, and that's why any solution has to have a UN stamp on it. But the problem was...
So when President Trump recognises Jerusalem, that's not binding on the international community?
Far from it. It's in total violation of Security Council resolutions, which say that East Jerusalem and the occupied territory, and the West Bank are occupied territories, and say it's got to be part of
resolution.
A complete resolution, all-round settlement of the issues. All of these words are loaded, because if you say settlement, it has other implications in this context, of course. But that's what he did, if you remember, to pander to the domestic lobby. Successive American presidents have promised to move the embassy, the US embassy to Jerusalem.
And there's been a lot of, obviously, support in Congress for that.
Yeah, but they never do it. And this is typical of American and lobby politics, is to raise money. The lobbyists will shout about Jerusalem moving. They don't really care.
You're talking about AIPAC and
the others, lobby. Yes, all of the various
including
ADLs,
including these days Christians United for Israel and the Evangelical Party.
These are great fundraisers for NGOs. You parade, you swing from the chandeliers, you shout about the embassy in Jerusalem.
Well, maybe we should try that at Just World Educational. What do you think?
The chandelier not good enough here. You've got a bit stronger chandelier.
Darn it, we'll have to just carry on doing our fundraising around peace and justice.
Yes, but so they raise money for this. I mean, it's a big issue. It's a definable issue. It's laden with patriotic, Zionist sentiment. They can always raise money for this. But Trump has almost spoiled the game for them by doing it. Yeah, I mean, they've got nothing to campaign about now. So they've lost a fundraising token. Similarly, by the way, the Israeli ambassador to the UN is clearly running for office back in Jerusalem. He's attracting exactly the same audience, rich American Zionist donors. Because he's swinging from the chandeliers at the UN.
So you actually have two ambassadors at the UN, both of whom are running for political office at home. That is Nikki Haley and...
Nikki Haley has been acting like the Israeli ambassador, and whether this is sort of... she's from India, she's close to Modi, who is reactionary, just like Likud, and is getting closer to Israel all the time. But more to the point is that this is a cunning move. Who are the big donors? She's going after the people who bankrolled Trump, the Christians and the die-hard Likud supporters.
The Sheldon Adelsons.
Yes. And by the way, we have to really put in, these people do not represent American Jews. Most American Jews are against settlements. They're against this whole move to Jerusalem at the moment.
They want to end the occupation. I totally agree.
But let's get in context. What Trump has done, he has declared that the very resolution which gave birth to Israel is null and void.
Yes.
Which is interesting when you come to the Palestinians and say you must recognise Israel because of the resolution. They say, hang on, yes, we'll accept it with the Jerusalem provision. And by the way, it's the same set of resolutions which have the right to return for Palestinians, right to return or compensation, which is always overlooked. So this comes as a package, but what's really concerning, I mean, apart from the plight of the Palestinians, which is always concerning, is the fact that Donald Trump, the president, has delivered a blow to the legitimacy, not the legitimacy of the UN, because he's got it, but delivered a huge blow to American relations, because he stood up in front of the world and told them that we don't care about UN resolutions. We don't care there's a Security Council resolution.
George W. Bush did essentially do that same thing in 2003 when he invaded Iraq. So, I mean, there is a precedent there. You know, they invaded Iraq with no attempt, well, an attempt, but a failed attempt.
They failed attempt. If you remember the coalition,
right.
It was a very interesting. First of all, and it's part of the way the UN works with the legitimation. Is key to George Bush was to get the British on side because that could appeal to Americans and say our oldest ally, you know, home of Churchill, all of that.
Wise leader.
yes, is on our side, so we're doing the right thing. And then they assembled the coalition of the willing. They had to provide some form of international legitimacy.
Well, international cover, it's not legitimacy.
Yes.
I mean, it's like, do you remember the Association of East...
This is false legitimacy along with false news.
An AstroTurf version of legitimacy.
Yeah. Some of the countries who put in the coalition of the willing hadn't been told they were in the coalition of the willing and were rather indignant. And then the State Department got Slovenia and Slovakia mixed up, which got people upset there as well.
Let's come back to Middle East, Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy today. We have this thing called the Quartet. Now, the Trump administration, by virtue of its step on Jerusalem and by virtue of its like terrible, mean-spirited cutting of half the US donation contribution to UNRWA, has definitely, roiled the situation, affected the situation. I would say reduced US power and authority in the UN and other international fora. What happens to the Quartet, which was founded as a way of folding the UN under US leadership, in essence? But now, is it appropriate for the United Nations to be in such a situation of being folded under so-called US leadership?
I would despair it was actually happening, but I think I called upon Ban Ki-moon to pull out.
Of what? Of the
to pull out of the Quartet. I mean, the Quartet had just become a fig leaf for US policy in the Middle East, and it was associated, instead of the UN saying, we have rules, there are laws, there are resolutions,
there's stuff going back to 1947.
Yeah, so they have basically got the UN, so-called, although there's no resolutions, signing on to pseudo solutions proposed by the United States, which in effect are pandering to Netanyahu and his chums.
And the Zionist settlement project. So there was no resolution that put the UN into the Quartet. Nothing from the Security Council?
No, I mean, I think you
the Security Council does every so often issue some resolutions in favour of what the Quartet is doing.
It sort of says we must keep up good work, old chaps.
Yeah.
Because remember that it also inveigled the Russians in there. This was at a time when the Russians were very much on the out and were weak and at a disadvantage. So it was one of the few occasions where the US actually did what it should have been doing all along and stroked the Russians as, of course you're a great power. Of course we want you along on this one.
So the Quartet is the US, the UN, Russia and the EU.
Yes.
So the EU is in somewhat of internal chaos now.
Well, it was even then. I mean, the EU is a perpetual extension.
Russia, meantime, has gotten quite a lot stronger in international relations and has its own interestingly strong relationship with Israel.
Yes, which is bizarre because, of course, in the good old days, lots of people saw Russia as a sort of Palestinians as a surrogate for Russia. And the Israelis as a surrogate for America. There are still people who think...
I actually wrote books about that.
There are people who still think, including MIT professors, who still think that Israel is a satellite of the US instead of the other way around.
So what's going to happen to the Quartet is my question.
Well, the Quartet is either going to just sort of hang around like a sort of festering zombie you keep in the closet and bring it out when the occasion demands, or it's just going to fade away. I don't think anyone's actually going to walk out on it. It gives Russia a moment of glory to pontificate on the Middle East. The European Union is, I think, they're basically there to provide the money.
Right.
It's to pay for what the Israelis do. You know, the Israelis regularly blow up hospitals, schools, etc. And then the European Union comes and rebuilds them.
But they would do that with or without the Quartet. I mean, that is part of Oslo.
Yes.
You know, basically with Oslo, the EU and Japan took on the cost of administering the civil aspects of the occupation.
Yeah, and
so Israel doesn't have
which is where the joke comes in on UNRWA. We're talking about grandstanding again. The withdrawal of funding for UNRWA, there are people like the Swedes and the Belgians are stepping up to the plate and saying this is too important to lose. But the Israelis don't want UNRWA's funding to go, because under the Geneva Conventions, they're supposed to be paying these costs in the West Bank and the Gaza. And they've always wanted... I
think the Israelis would like to completely defund everything that UNRWA does in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria.
Yeah, they don't care about that, except...
because they want those states to take on responsibility and to naturalize, and they want the Palestinians
but until those states actually do, can you think, do you really want a breeding ground for people with die-hard and possibly violent tendencies against Israel? Then you take large refugee camps and pull their funding so they don't have food, they don't have health, and don't have education.
With legitimate claims on land and property inside what is now considered to be Israel.
No, I mean, it's very sure. The far side is what they all would want to do was to keep UNRWA off balance, on the hop, which they've always done. But they've all the people I know who work with UNRWA, they actually have, you know, a good working relationships in many ways with the local Israeli officers, because they know how essential it is.
Yeah, with Kogat here and Kogat there. And also, we're not talking huge amounts of money. In terms of making up the deficit, and it just is a reduction of US influence, because, you know, money always buys influence.
If people come in and the amount figures consistently for many decades show that Americans have a very inflated idea of how much they give in aid to the rest of the world.
That's
and
right.
The Palestinians in particular, you know, he gives millions and millions. You know, they gave money. He didn't give money to the Palestinians. It was the others that did that. The US was a generous donor to UNRWA.
And has been a generous donor to the Palestinian security forces, whose role is to enforce the security aspects.
The average Palestinian on the street does not really think that because Fatah has very heavily armed police, his life is much better for it.
His or her life.
His or her life, okay. Yes, sorry.
So if we could switch a little bit and talk about Yemen, and talk about what looks like yet another massive failure of the United Nations. And to me, anyway, it looks like massive complicity of the US, which has been providing refueling for the Saudi...
Providing the fuel, it's providing the jets. I mean, it's not just a gas station in the desert we're talking.
I think the Saudis do have a little bit of jet fuel of their own.
Yes.
But, you know, the aerial refueling and the targeting and a lot of what, you know, what's described as the Saudi-led coalition, but also, you know, turns out not to be much of a coalition, but more just Saudi Arabia, in their now nearly 3-year-old campaign against Yemen that has been so horribly damaging. And there are still, I guess, some UN bodies that are active inside Yemen, like UNICEF.
Yes, and they complain because of the results.
And the World Food Programme, and, you know, you've got very widespread starvation, you've got cholera on a scale that hasn't been seen for 100 years, and, you know, the Saudis had closed the one port, the port at Hodeidah. And what is the UN able to do about a humanitarian catastrophe like that?
I mean, it's not fair to say the UN has failed, because the UN hasn't tried anything, because the UN is an association of nations, and the other nations, the
UN agencies have been doing what they can, but they can't open the port by force.
But on the large political scale, is that there's been a complete... people sound cautionary notes, but what no one is prepared to do is to stand up to the Saudis. And now we have this weird relationship where the Saudis, as you know, are the most explicitly anti-Semitic nation in the Middle East.
I don't think you can label an entire nation as.
I'm talking about, no, excuse me, the Saudis are the royal family. Remember?
Right.
We're not talking about the Arabs there.
Yeah.
This is one of the few countries that's named after
Right.
a clan, a tribal family.
Right.
So the Saudis never consulted the rest of the Arabs about what they were going to call their nation.
And there are still Arabs who call it Al Jazeera.
Sure.
Which is why the Saudis really hate the Qataris for naming their broadcasting.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit as though we called Britain the Hanoverian or the Mountbattenish or the Windsor state.
Yes. Or
but
the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, for
yes,
example.
well, they do have Jordan in there. So they've said, I mean, they have got this operation going, and what they have done, because they have access to large amounts of ready cash, and now they've got this de facto access with the Israelis.
To Israeli power, political
yes,
power.
Yes,
and to the White House.
And to the White House. I mean, it wasn't as though that the Saudis lacked their own telephones. They could get onto the White House, and they covered for many, many things. If you remember in the past, one of the few occasions the Israeli lobby was actually defeated was in favour of the Saudis overselling them jets. So it was my lobby's bigger than your lobby. So now these two lobbies are together, and under the guise, the jihad or the crusade or whatever against Iran, they're battering Yemen, and no one dares say differently. The UN has tried, and they've produced reports, and the Saudis.
When you say the UN, are we talking about
the various
Secretary
agencies?
General? I mean,
yes, the Secretary General tried, and then.
I know the humanitarian aid agencies, obviously, from time to time issue these dire reports, which are entirely.
Well, there've been commissions and inquiries that have shown things.
But tell me what the Secretary General has.
He did the report. He produced a report last year about the children in warfare, or the UN did in his name, and the Saudis came and basically said, "We will, this will cost you hundreds of millions of dollars in projects for other people if you don't pull this." So he didn't pull it. He put it on hold while they re-examined it, and it's a terrible dilemma. I mean, would the report have made a difference if it's not backed up by the others? If the Europeans and the others, because of course the British and others are complicit in supplying arms to the Saudis as well.
They're all competing to supply.
Yes, I mean the whole
French,
basis. Yes,
they're all out there.
How many Mirage do you want? How many Exocet missiles? They are, they're all complicit. They're all in fear of the Saudi petrodollar, and where are the people of principle?
And the Saudis have a sort of a veneer of legitimability in Yemen, because they are supporting Abdurabu al-Hadi, who is described as the legitimate president. But
I can't see what's legitimate about him. He looks pretty much like all the others.
Yeah, at the same time, of course, they...
It didn't help that the Houthis have just killed the guy they regarded as legitimate.
Who was the
the politics gets very, very messy. The one thing we know here is that the losers are the Yemeni people on every level.
The children,
the children, the women, and the men as well. I mean, they're getting killed. The bombs drop on everybody fairly indiscriminately. And the problem here is that nobody's prepared to do anything about it. This is a whole nation being ground into the rubble that was living on the edge anyway. Mm-hmm. You've been to Yemen and you've seen.
I actually haven't,
it's a beautiful place, but it really is living on the edge. It's in terms of water, occasional rainfall, irrigation.
So what could change this? I mean, what can we as US citizens, I'm a US citizen, don't know about you, but what should we be doing to protect the rights of the people of Yemen and see an end to just, minor goals here? An end
I think exposure. I mean, what we need is more exposure. I mean, of what's happening in Yemen, what's happening to the Yemenis, and who's doing it. I mean, we really need, some of the humanitarian. It didn't help them very much, but the noise over Darfur, the noise over Bosnia, and the other humanitarian. I say disasters, but disasters has an impersonal, because this is This is directed.
This is man-made.
This is not a humanitarian tragedy. This is humanitarian
this
murder.
is not just an earthquake or a landslide.
This is
mass murder.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I guess there are a couple of little legislative initiatives here in this country, to condition the aid, not the aid, but the arms sales.
No, but then you're going to run head into the two most powerful lobbies.
The two most powerful.
Oh, plus
lobbies.
the Pentagon. So you could say.
Yeah, well, that's part of what
too exponential. I mean, they're part of the same show, and you've really got to how much do people care, and that's where I suppose the best job we can do is to make people care, is to expose what's happening in Yemen as much as possible. And also to expose the complicity of Western governments and what they forced the UN to do, and to raise the pressure on the UN to say, look, you're our humanitarian beacons. I mean, we can hope that some of the smaller countries on the Security Council who have got a record for principle will stand up and start denouncing, and say, no, up with this we will not put, inshallah, as they say.
So in the book, by the way, Untold, the real story of the United Nations in Peace and War, you talk about the history of peacekeeping. Now, I know this might seem a little distant, but if you're to see a two-state solution in Palestine, there would have to be a peacekeeping aspect to it.
But this is where we get stickler, because the Israelis have never accepted. If you remember, the very first peacekeepers were on the border between Egypt and Israel, and Israel wouldn't accept them on its side of the border.
Right.
Would only accept them on the other side of the border. And
was that the case with the peacekeepers in Syria? This was UNSO, the UN truce.
But they weren't peacekeepers; they were monitors.
Right.
They were supervised. They're still there. I mean,
they've been there since 1948.
Yeah, it's like the British sort of British baronial titles. Once you've got them, you never give them up.
So the first peacekeepers were United Nations Expeditionary Force or whatever it was.
Yes, it was UNF. It was on the boat. It was in Suez. They invented blue helmets for it.
Right.
And actually, basically, they were writing the rules, because this was the first time this had happened.
That was after the 56 invasion.
Yes, there were 56, but the big one was after 56. Sorry, they were the ones that NASA was ordered to move in 67, and the Israelis used that as the excuse to attack.
Well, he ordered them to move. He wasn't ordered to.
He ordered them to move. Yes.
Which since the Israelis had never accepted them inside Israel.
Oh, it's perfectly legitimate to do so. And look, I mean, he was right, but as always, often with NASA, big mouth, not much forethought for what was going to happen. He should have seen the consequences. There were people in the Knesset who were jumping up and down for joy when he was so stupid.
And there were definitely a lot of people in the Israeli military who were preparing for the 67 war.
Yeah,
and a whole story that I actually wrote a little bit about recently about LBJ and Matilda Krim, but that's a completely different aspect. But the first thing was NASA ordered the UN peacekeepers out, and that gave the...
But you remember when the Israelis withdrew from Sinai, they wouldn't accept international peacekeepers. It was one of the few occasions where the US...
Right.
was asked to step up to the plate.
So you're talking about the Camp David Accords, not 56. Yes. You're talking
afterwards.
The second time.
The second time. So they actually got US people in there because
which are still there, amazingly, because Sinai is an absolute hotbed of insecurity and terrible things.
But they weren't there to stop things happening. I mean, they were there to monitor the Egyptian army not coming back.
And to
now the Israelis have one of these wonderful dilemmas. Of course, they want the Egyptians to control the fundamentalists in the Sinai Desert, but don't want them to move troops in. So it's a classic conundrum for them on how these things go. Now peacekeepers are different, and the whole thing of peacekeeping has evolved. They're very passive in their role, and there's been a recent report, and it just sort of states the obvious: if you're being shot at, you should shoot back.
I mean, that was obviously a big conundrum in Bosnia, and the role of the Dutch in Bosnia.
In Srebrenica, yes. And no, I mean, it was proved the other way around, because on several occasions especially the Scandinavian battalions, and this is the problem with the UN, is it's balkanized. the peacekeeping forces. The Serb militia never tried to stop the Scandinavian battalion, because the first time they tried, they got shot at. Big style, by big strapping Nordics with Viking blood. And they did not try to stop Scandinavian convoys after that. They would stop French convoys, because the French were under instructions to collaborate with their Serb friends. I mean, this is one of the problems with peacekeeping, is you don't have a unified control.
And you don't have a unified rule of engagement.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, if you take Sierra Leone, for example, that's one of the few occasions I would support Tony Blair, was, I believe, the Indian commanders were basically ordering their troops to hand over their weapons when ordered to by the militia. Tony Blair got an aircraft carrier off there and sort of blew up the militia base on the top of a hill and kept blowing it up until they sort of thought that there may be better things to do with what's left of their lives as a result. And that's the real point about the peacekeepers, is that they're a thin blue line. It should be a tripwire.
Yeah.
And it should be followed up. But that follow-up is in the hands of other people. And we saw that in Bosnia, where people on the ground were saying, you know, they're shelling this town, you must take out those batteries. And it would be going up and down through the corridors of the UN and NATO and back again.
And you saw it in Rwanda very, very clearly when, you know, Romeo Dallaire, bless him, was you know...
One of the great tragedies of the last century. I mean, there should be an opera for Romeo Dallaire. I mean, he was persecuted by the Canadian military when he got back as well for doing the right thing. You know, he's a genuine hero. And
maybe that could be your next writing project. Have you ever written an opera?
I'll have to sing. I'll sing the part. but yeah. So it's no, that is a very serious issue, and you've got to have a unified chain. But the UN is dependent on. They call up these people, and whatever troops are available, they're desperate. I mean, in the case of Cambodia, the Bulgarians sent a Bulgarian punishment battalion, a penal battalion of convicts. Who, you know, added their own mayhem. You know, they made the Khmer Rouge look like cuties almost by the time they'd finished. Sorry, Bulgaria. And that's you know, it is a serious problem. The whole question of rape and sexual assault. The UN takes the blame, but they have no means of enforcing military discipline against a French legionnaire or a Congolese. A Congolese soldier in Mali or whatever the various combinations are. And so, some countries, you know, especially the Scandinavians, have a very distinguished record of providing, you know, highly trained and responsible troops. The Irish are a case in point, and I mean, just throwing it in for, you know, apropos of everything that we said, I remember speaking to an Irish diplomat who had said that the Israeli ambassador to the UN had come up to him and said, when are you going to recognise Israel? Because Ireland didn't. And he said, I told him, when you stop sending our boys from UNIFIL home in body bags, we'll consider it, but not till then. Which is one of the greatest put-downs ever, I thought.
UNIFIL being the UN force in South Lebanon, has had
a large Irish contingent
and many set to's with the Israelis who periodically.
Yeah, no, it was one of the reasons why Ireland is so sympathetic to the Palestinians as a general rule, is exposure to Israel in Lebanon and what it's been doing.
So we need to wrap this up a little bit. Let's come back to the whole question of the US role in the UN and its effects on the Palestinian issue and other issues in the Middle East. So obviously the US has a sort of a disproportionate position in the UN, given that, you know, US citizens make up 5% of the population of the world, and Washington's influence in the UN is considerably more than 5%.
Well, 25% of the budget helps
well,
a lot
yeah,
as well, and a veto, and the world's biggest 50% of the world's military. I mean, you know, all of these things do add up.
If we want to get fair and implemented policies from the United Nations on Palestine, for example, how do we do that?
I think it's a twofold approach. First of all, is inside the United States, letting people know the facts, letting them know what their representatives are doing in their name, and not in our name would be a good slogan for this as well. but it's also persuading...
There is already a great...
Yes, I know, I've heard about this, yes. Plagiarism is my speciality. I'm a writer. But the other part of this is the need to keep pressure from other countries. Now, often other countries, because the State Department, the US has some very good diplomats, the State Department actually try to work with international law. They try to square the circle with what Trump
They did.
and
I'm not so
Nikki
sure they
Haley.
are right now.
They're not as much as they used to, because they've been weeded out, they've been purged. But they try to do this, and one of the ways they do it is they'll go to the British and the French and the others, and they say, look, we've got these crackpots in Congress. You must accommodate us on this resolution, so that we can get something through here. And people go along with it. People, they accommodated John Bolton, knowing that the State Department would make sure he didn't do too much harm. At the moment, we have Nikki Haley being backed up by the White House, so we have a sort of derangement squared here. And other countries have got to start confronting and saying, no, which they have begun to, even the small ones. I mean, I think it's Botswana issued a memorable rebuke to Nikki Haley when she threatened to pull the funds on any country that voted against
the Jerusalem resolution.
Yes, I mean that was the most inept piece of diplomacy since Pearl Harbor.
Well, that's good. So it's kind of a multiplying effect of ineffective diplomacy on.
Yeah, I mean you can see that with Canada, by all accounts from Canada, Trudeau, because Canada has gone and Australia are now behaving like the old white Commonwealth and supporting Israel beyond all measure, even when Britain doesn't anymore, and Trudeau was going to support the US on that resolution until she made that threat, and then he would have had he would visibly spineless in the face of Canadian public opinion. Basically Washington had told him what to do and threatened him, so they actually abstained in the end. It would have been much better if Trudeau lived up to the principles he declares in other qualities and voted against. Because if you look,
but still,
Canadian policy is still there on
settlements. We do need to wrap this up,
Yeah.
but I think what's clear is that the United Nations is an important place for people who are concerned about Palestinian rights and other.
It's essential.
Middle East
The UN encapsulates the Palestinian rights.
So everybody who cares about peace and justice in the Middle East should buy your book.
As well, that's a very good start.
And invite you to come and speak to community groups about the UN and what is possible and necessary and what can be done there. So thank you, Ian.
Thank you. We'll take our dog and pigeon show wherever you want.